housing's expensive everywhere. But guess who takes the gold medal for the most outrageous housing disaster? That's right, the land down under, where the dream of owning your own home with a backyard wasn't just a dream, it was a reality. A reality so normal, so achievable, that you didn't even have to work more than an average job just to get it. But now, the dream isn't just dead, it's been ripped away, stolen from an entire generation. And for what? To keep inflating this ridiculous housing bubble so that all those who own property can retire in bloody luxury? I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Reasons why you shouldn't subscribe to my channel. I talk funny, I'm losing my hair, I eat too much garlic, and I use olive oil way too much. Now, reasons why you should subscribe to my channel. Can't think of any, but why don't you go ahead and do it anyway? I'm your friendly Greek neighborhood Adonis, and together we might just rule the galaxy. Today we're checking out this video titled Why Life in Australia Has Become Impossible, and this one's been created by the channel Hindsight, which is a foreign YouTube channel, and what I want to know is why are these YouTube channels focusing on the disaster in Australia, and how are they getting so many views from it? Let's check it out to see why.
The Australian dream is dying. This idea of encouraging people to buy a house when you're young and accumulate wealth over time has made Australians the 4th richest people on earth.
And if we look at median wealth, Australia is actually 2nd in the world behind Luxembourg. Now this here shows the median wealth per adult in US dollars. Now in Australian dollars that comes to around 418,000, and you can bet your bottom dollar that the majority of this wealth comes from ultra inflated house prices. What other way could Australia be the 2nd most wealthy country in the world? And you wonder why Australians are so obsessed with house prices. 'Cause it's made them bloody rich.
But their housing market is on fire. The median cost of a house doubled from under $500,000 in 2011 to nearly $1 million in 2024, and wages didn't keep up.
Wages went nowhere. In a healthy housing market, house prices would rise around about the same as wages and inflation, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's a valuable asset, so you'd expect it to rise over time. But when you see house prices massively outperform even inflation, you know you've right royally screwed up, and the prize for basically screwing it up the worst goes to Australia.
Australia is a massive country, roughly the size of the United States without Alaska, but they only have 5 large cities. Sydney and Melbourne account for 40% of their total population. And together with Adelaide, they're on the list of 10 least affordable cities in the world, where it costs upwards of 10 times the annual income to buy a house.
There's absolutely no way that Brisbane wouldn't also be on that list, especially considering that house prices in Brisbane are now more than Melbourne. So that would mean we've now got 4 cities in the top 10 least affordable in the world. What an absolute embarrassment and total failure over many decades. Yet policymakers and millions of Australian property owners basically salivate because house prices have been pushed into the stratosphere. Surely this would be sending alarm bells to those who are in charge of housing policy. But alas, it feels like they don't give a shit.
I am nearly 27 years old, and today I am moving back in with my parents.
The demand for rental properties is insane.
If you're a renter in Australia, not only have you watched by and seen house prices get further and further out of reach, you've also suffered because Australia allowed its rental vacancy rate to get to below 1%, which is pretty much emergency levels. A healthy rental vacancy rate's around 3%, so renters in Australia have been absolutely screwed from every angle.
The great Australian dream is the belief that home ownership will lead to a better and more prosperous life. This was backed up by government policies that kept housing affordable and within reach.
I think the great Australian dream is that everyone has a fair go of working hard and building a great life for themselves. Not every Australian wants to get rich. Many just want to have the freedom to do what they want. But if you can't even afford your own home, you're basically always going to be living in survival mode, and that's not the life I want to see for my fellow Australians.
Where did it actually go wrong? There was a major shift of priorities in the 1980s, from seeing housing primarily as a fundamental human right towards investing in housing for profit.
Australians aren't stupid. If there's money on offer, they'll go for it. When it became obvious in Australia that massive capital gains could be made from housing, more and more Australians woke up, and that started this speculative mania we now see today. Not only have Australians witnessed more and more demand enter the housing market, they've also realised that investing in property is one of the most tax-effective ways to grow wealth. And that's because you can own your own home and pay no capital gains tax, or you can own an investment property and claim negative gearing and also capital gains tax discount. So we've witnessed consistent massive capital gains, we've realized you can minimize tax, and the trifecta, we've seen that the government and the RBA will never intentionally allow the housing market to crash. That's basically the closest thing to a sure bet, and it's no wonder Aussies have flooded into housing just like flies to shit.
The government incentivized people to buy a second home and to put this on the market to rent. This increased the number of investors on the market, increasing demand and thus raising prices.
The worst thing is, there was clear evidence that more and more investors were entering the market, and as house prices rose, more and more first home buyers were getting completely locked out. So home ownership in Australia is actually falling, and for young people, the figures are absolutely shocking. Yet at the same time, more and more property owners are buying additional investments because their property prices have risen so much, they're cashed up through the bloody roof. Now I'm all for people working hard, taking risks, and getting ahead financially. But I'm not for a rigged system that purposely benefits property owners but seems to make it impossibly difficult for those who don't own a home.
Negative gearing of property has been super effective at making a small army of well-off Australians even richer.
The reason why it's bad is that it actually gives people an incentive to take out a loan to compete with people who are buying just for a house to live in, and it massively distorts housing prices.
I'm all for reducing tax, and if housing was affordable for everyone, I'd be more than happy with these policies. However, since house prices have gotten more and more unaffordable compared to the average wage, it's a completely rigged system if you provide all the benefits to those who already own property but fail to provide any benefits to those who don't. I mean, here's a perfect example. An ultra-rich Aussie buys a $20 million home, lives in it, and sells it 10 years later for 30 million. They've pocketed a capital gain of 10 million completely tax-free. On the other end, you've got a would-be homeowner trying to save for a deposit, and on their small deposit in the bank, they make a little bit of interest and still have to pay tax on that interest. Can you see the outrageousness of this system? Just how difficult it is for those trying to get into the market?
But this is part of a much larger puzzle.
Interest rates have been slashed to yet another record low.
We could very well see another 0.25% rate cut in the coming months.
This last decade was a wild ride. Interest rates dropped and dropped even further, with the goal to support economic growth and to maintain inflation.
After the global financial crisis, interest rates kept getting cut for over a decade. The cash rate in Australia even went so low as below 1% prior to COVID. So property owners during that decade saw consistently lower and lower interest rates, which basically reduced their expenses and provided them more money to invest with. So there's just so many levers that increase demand for property in Australia, and lower interest rates has definitely been one of those levers.
During the pandemic, like in many other countries, they dropped to nearly zero. These extremely low rates made it easier for people to get a loan for a house, which meant that it increased demand, thus raised prices.
Right now, our cash rate is above 4%, and you'd think the entire world is collapsing. All the media harps on about is when we're going to get our next rate cut. But consider this. Our current cash rate is actually below the long-term average. So it's obvious that Australia has piled way too much debt into housing that we can no longer survive under even normal interest rates. But the government and the RBA know that, and they'd much rather see rates fall than actually trying to reduce house prices and improving housing affordability. Australia is now in clown-like territory when it comes to the housing market.
On top of this, the government spent billions of dollars on programs that market intended to help low and middle income families to buy their first house.
This is all Australia does to try and make it look like they're doing something about housing. There's been so many first homeowner grants over the years which help a very small amount of people but actually make it worse for everyone because it just serves to inflate house prices more. I mean, now they're trying to put through programs where Aussies need less and less deposit. They're talking about using super to buy your first home. Banks are talking about offering longer and longer mortgage terms, say 40 or even 50 years. I mean, Australia will do anything in its power to keep kicking this housing bubble can down the road. Instead of actually trying to address the root cause, let's just see how far we can push it. It's bloody bewildering.
The number of government-sponsored public houses that were built dropped from a peak of 20,000 in 1978 to just 3,000 in 2023.
I mean, Aussies love it how the government sponsors healthcare in Australia, where everyone gets to receive free public healthcare, especially in an emergency. But when it comes to housing, let's hand it over to the private sector and act confused as house prices keep going through the roof.
While all of this was going on, Australia in the past 2 years let in a record number of immigrants.
This is potentially the biggest betrayal of all. We've just seen one of the most speculative housing bubbles ever, yet we turn on every single immigration lever in our disposal, flooding the country with record amounts of immigrants, while hardworking Aussies not only couldn't afford a home, but also now could hardly afford to rent. And even worse, rental demand was so crazy, many have been forced to live in their cars or even in tents. I mean, you've seen the pictures of the 1970s and 80s in Australia. The lifestyle was so relaxed and great that you only needed one income per household to easily afford a home and to pay it off very quickly. So from there, you could have a family and just live your life in some sort of financial security. How could we let it deteriorate so quickly that in 3 decades, it's almost now impossible? And many people will say, yeah, but life in Australia is still so much better than many other countries. But does that mean we purposely try to deteriorate our quality of life for Australians? We should be trying to hang on to this quality with everything we have.
Immigration can help Australia fill gaps in its labour force, but it's also adding to already mounting domestic pressures.
I, for the life of me, cannot understand why this Labor government has just slammed the door shut on this mass immigration until we've got enough housing for Australians right now.
Australians have been so gaslit on immigration, it's not even funny. We've heard stories like we need more immigrants to build more houses. But guess what? Only 0.6% of immigrants actually work in the construction field. 0.6. All the while, the additional immigrants coming into the country all need housing, which just increases demand overall. This policy has been an absolute disaster for the Australian housing market.
The peak of record immigration coincided with 5 consecutive quarters of a shrinking GDP per capita, the longest recorded decline in Australia's history. It also coincided with a record increase of what Australians are paying for rent.
So if you're not getting the exact targeted skills that you need, record immigration levels make life worse for millions of Australians. The Aussies that are loving it are those who have property portfolios who are seeing all this increased demand for housing send their house prices into the stratosphere.
In 1987, a house in Australia cost 2.8 times the annual income, similar to other countries. By 2019, this was up to 6.9 times, outpacing the US, Canada, and the UK. But in 2023, it went up to 9.7 times the annual income, the highest in the world after Hong Kong.
This is disgraceful and should never have been allowed to happen. Since basically the year 2000, we've consistently seen house prices outperform wages. Now looking at that, we should have taken drastic action to reduce some of that speculation from the property market so that house prices don't get out of reach for future generations. But what did we do? We actually did the opposite and pour more fuel onto the housing market, pushing every single lever to keep pumping up demand, sending house prices ever higher. When are we going to learn that we need to reduce demand for property so that house prices can ease?
The great Australian dream of owning a house and accumulating wealth over time is getting out of reach. A full-time worker on a minimum wage now spends on average 68% of their income on rent.
Either that, or they have to forever live in share accommodation or continue to live with their parents. I mean, it's no wonder that the birth rate in Australia has fallen through the floor. When you don't have housing security, it's very difficult to start making large decisions like having a family. Renting in many countries in the world is a very viable option, but sadly in Australia, renters have been so abandoned, they basically have to push a boulder uphill just to try to get ahead financially.
This makes it impossible to save up for a down payment on a house. This increases the number of people that will always rent, while homeowners are becoming incredibly wealthy.
And that's why the gap between the wealthy and everyone else is getting wider and wider. Australia is quickly becoming a two-tier wealth system based on how much property your family owns. And that's not a fair and egalitarian system that provides hope for everybody. That's a system built on a property house of cards.
The fear is that this can create a two-class society. Wealthy homeowners against disadvantaged renters.
It already is, and it's creating a ton of anger and frustration, especially for those being locked out of the housing market. Personally, I think Australians should be more angry, even those who own property. It's not good enough that we hand future generations a broken and unfair housing market.
This is, of course, happening all around the world. But Australia is unique in that it transformed from having one of the best and most affordable housing markets into one of the worst and least affordable.
This obsession with using property to grow unrealistic wealth needs to end, and it needs to end now. It's destroying the hopes and dreams of millions of Australians, and that is unacceptable. I'm Biko Konstantinos.